So, our next guest speaker is going to talk to us about readiness drivers and the depot, and that would be Mr. Don Nitti. So he's the Acting Executive Director of AMCOM Logistics Center, ALC, and I'm kind of confused why you're still acting, but you know, I know that's not your issue. But what I will tell you is that on his way out, Bill Marriott told me whatever questions you had for him, he didn't get to answer, that Don would be happy to answer those. So, Don.
It's funny how that always ends up to work out that way. Well, good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. As was said, I'm Don Nitti. I'm the Acting Executive Director for the AMCOM Logistics Center. I've been in the position for about 5 months now. I've been drinking from the fire hose, but I have a absolute wonderful, dedicated team, not only within the ALC, but across the enterprise to make things happen. So for those of you who don't know about the AMCOM Logistics Center, our mission is to deliver life cycle logistics support to ensure sustainable material readiness for aviation and missile systems. So that is a very broad mission. A lot of mission sets are within that, and we do that through 4 core functions that you could see listed there. But for today's discussion, we'll focus primarily on sustainment logistics, which has a lot of functions to that, but primarily managing the supply chain for aviation. And then industrial operations. So we have the mission of workloading the depots, but both Corpus Christi as well as Letterkenny, and not only making sure that they have the right workload, but that they have supportable and executable programs so they could provide the proper output to the Army. So what is the health of our aviation supply chain? And Mr. Marriott spoke about this. If you look at our readiness rates, if you look at our NMCS rates, they look very good. But where the risk is in certain areas where we do lack depth. He spoke specifically about General Perna and General Gabram's focus on building that strategic depth back in our supply chain, as well as focusing on our 33 readiness drivers in aviation. But our mission is to focus heavily on the readiness drivers, but we have to focus on everything, right? Because it only takes one part to keep an aircraft from flying. So we have the mission to focus on everything. What I will do is I'm going to expound a little on the details behind the how we're going to do that. Mr. Marriott spoke about a lot of the challenges that we have, and I would like to show you some of the solutions that we're driving to help us build that strategic depth. So, to build strategic depth and to be able to react to whatever the next high op-tempo requirement is, we have to have multiple sources. And Mr. Marriott spoke about that. So we want to eliminate single points of failure, and we also want to have capacity that we could expand to surge requirements. We understand that for every component and for every item, we may not be able to do that, but where possible, that's what we're looking for. Our priorities are to repair organically first, to repair commercially second, and then when required and when necessary and appropriate, to procure third. But we need all 3 of those. It says on the slide a balanced approach, and balanced is probably not the right word because it's not an equitable approach. It is the appropriate approach for that component, but that gives us options to be able to react to the needs of the Army and the mission. We are looking to expand our capability as well as workload at Corpus Christi Army Depot. Colonel Atkins talked about that. She showed what the outstanding capabilities that they currently have and the workforce that they have, but we want to be strategically looking into the future. And we're not just looking for any workload. We are looking for the right workload. We want to make sure that the capacity that we do have are focused on the right outputs for the Army, and that when we're looking at future capabilities, we're looking deep at additive manufacturing, we're looking at composite repairs, we're looking at the things that we're going to need to sustain our force into the future. We're interested in partnerships, obviously. I know that Colonel Atkins touched on that, but that is critical to our success. The supply chain is a team sport, and depot operations, obviously, we require partnerships with our OEMs to be successful there. So data accuracy has been a significant challenge for us for a while. We've recognized that, and there have been significant efforts made to make sure that the data that we have in L&P and the data that we have in our systems that tell us what to do are accurate. And there's a number of things that we're doing to get after that, because bad data leads to bad forecasting, leads to challenges. So we have developed inside of the AMCOM Logistics Center an automated tool, the Data Quality Analysis Tool, which is actually developed and it's implemented in phase 1. And so the concept is we have to start with the front gate, right? So we have to make sure that all the data that goes into L&P initially is as accurate as it can be. Previously, when OEMs delivered provisioning data that was entered into L&P, it would be delivered in thousands and thousands of fields of code that in the past a provisioner would have to go through to check for accuracy, what codes are allowed to be blank, what are not, what are the proper codes based on our business rules. And that process was very time-consuming, and it was subjective to a lot of human error. So a lot of bad data was being entered into L&P from the start. What this tool allows us to do is within a matter of minutes now to run thousands of lines of provisioning code against our business rules, and it spits out a report to the provisioner, and this is just a very simplified example, but it will say out of 55,000 lines of code, 13,000 have suspected errors. Then it describes exactly what those errors are in those codes, and it assigns a risk level that tells the provisioner what the risk is to accepting that data as is versus going back and getting the data corrected prior to entering it into the system. So that's step 1, making sure what we're putting into the system is accurate. Secondly, we're expanding this tool. The next step is we will take existing data out of L&P, run it through the tool, identify where there is errors, and then we'll be able to manually correct those data so we can get as accurate data as possible into our systems. So data in the system is only as accurate as the last transaction. So there's a lot of efforts that are being made to improve our business processes, and those business processes go from the provisioner to the shop floor of the depot. Over the last several years, we've identified where the errors are in our business processes, and we are correcting those. If you don't confirm a production order, if you don't record use of resources, all those errors eventually lead to production problems, forecasting problems, and financial problems. So we are emphasizing process discipline, process controls, metrics to measure that, and over the last 5 months, we've had a consistent reduction in error reports that we're receiving. Mr. Marriott talked about item manager training. I would say it a little bit different. I'd say that there was a lot of concurrent training or refresher training that was required, and so we do have a much more robust item manager refresher training program that is taking place. But as under Shape the Fight, our reorganization, as Mr. Marriott talked about, we're actually changing the way we onboard and progress our item managers. We're going more to what you would know as a green platoon. So when our interns are coming in, the next group are coming in the spring, they will basically go into a controlled environment with a master trainer, and they will actually execute their mission managing some low volume, low risk parts. But a master trainer will take them through the process over a 6-month to 1 year timeline where they're actually doing their job under supervision, learning how to do the process right before they are put out onto the weapon system team. So that's one of the efforts we have. So accurate data and accurate forecasting is obviously very important, but then once you have a forecast, you have to get it on contract, right? And we all know that contracting has been one of our challenges. It has been for some time, but I will tell you that significant improvements have been made. We have a great working relationship and partnership with ACC Redstone as well as DLA Aviation. But one of the things that we have done within the last year is we've automated the system, and we're basically using theory of constraints to track our contract administrative lead times. The way the process is set up is there's 8 different gates that a contract has to go through before it's awarded. There's a standard time limit that is set to each gate depending on the complexity of the contract. So there's 13 different paths that a contract can take through this gated process, but each gate has a gatekeeper. It may be DLA, it may be Army Contracting Command Redstone, it may be ALC, it may be MRDAC, but whoever owns that gate is responsible. So bi-weekly, we're meeting to review what is in the gate and what is over standard, and what is the priority that has to be pushed out of that gate. We have a backlog that we're clearing right now. DLA or Aviation has done a great job with their burn down plan. We've significantly reduced the contracts that are in the gates. You could see there on the right side of the chart that in May alone, we had 503 contracts that were out of standard. Today, we're down to 248, so roughly a reduction of 50% in the last 5 months, and we want to get that obviously down to 0. We talk about reducing administrative lead time, and that's important. We want to get things on contract as quickly as possible, but it's also to have predictability and low variance, and that's what affects us a lot as well. If we think if it takes 300 days to get something on contract, that may be okay. If we understand it takes 300 days to get it on contract, we know 300 days in advance that we need it, and we put it on contract. We start the contract process 300 days in advance. Where we get in trouble is we think it takes 90 days, and it takes 300 days. So we're working through the gated process to reduce both the time and the variance, so at least we know how long it takes our contracts to get through the process. Mr. Marriott talked about supplier engagements, and they have absolutely increased in the number of engagements that we have. We've always had engagements at the item manager level, at the supplier item manager level, maybe at the division level, but probably did not have the emphasis that we have today, all the way up to Major General Gabram holding some of these engagements. He dedicates a lot of his time on a monthly basis to meeting with suppliers. And it has been beneficial in the fact that really not only that we get the opportunity to express our requirements, but we also get the opportunity to learn what the constraints and what the challenges are from the OEM perspective. Because at the end of the day, again, this is a team requirement. We have to find out to communicate and find a path to mutual success. So our supplier engagements have been beneficial, and they will continue. So I've talked about where our problems are. I've talked about what we are doing to try to get after those problems, ultimately to build strategic depth in the supply system. So how could the enterprise help? So first off, I'd say continued engaged partnership. We want that communication. We want that teamwork. We want to understand the capabilities and where you can assist. Responsiveness to requirements, primarily reducing, where possible, production lead times. I talked about our challenge to reduce the ALT and to get it on contract faster, but we also need the production lead times to come down. If you saw Mr. Marriott's chart and some of those extremely long lead time parts. And I understand it's easy to stand up here and say, hey, we need to reduce production lead time, but there's materials, sub-vendors, there's machines, there's bottlenecks, there's a lot of factors that go into it, so it's not as easy as it sounds. But where possible, that's where we need the teaming to bring those production lead times to the left. Quality processes are extremely important. I don't have to talk to anybody in this room about why quality in aviation is important. Everybody understands the safety aspect of it, but the effects on the supply chain are also very difficult when there is a quality process that's not followed and there's a recall that requires us to inspect, remove, issue stock that may not be in necessarily the healthiest stock posture. So holding sub-vendors accountable and following quality processes is critical. And then again, improve reliability. The longer we can keep an item on wing, the more life we get out of that item, the less demand there is on the supply chain. So having said that, these are our points of contact. We are always open to discussion, and I will take whatever questions you had from Mr. Marriott at this time. If I can't answer them, I'm going to write them down, and I'll have him send you an email.
You've been saved so far, Don. You got a question out of the audience.
How you doing, sir? Mike Webb with the Megit. My question is, during this 2 days, are we going to be provided a list of those 33 critical line items that are...
I'm sorry, it's really difficult to hear. Can you say it one more time?
During these today and tomorrow, are we going to be provided a list of those 33 critical items that... I'm not an OEM, but I do provide aircraft parts to those OEMs, and knowing those critical parts that would be help us to forecast and to help the OEMs meet those requirements.
Yeah, I understand that and appreciate it. The list won't be released because there's some sensitivity to the quantities that are on that list. But I'll tell you that the OEMs and the vendors who own those items know what those items are. We are in regular contact with them. They know what the inhibitors are, and they're tracking those. I think it's a sensitivity issue and a risk issue of why that Mr. Marriott did not want to release that list.
Other questions? Oh, good.
So I have to ask my other boss a question. And I recommend we might want to expand upon this one in your readiness panel here
Okay.
after the lunch break. But to the gentleman's point, I think the question that we all sort of were working through is, since our ERPs are sending out forecast demands. We know that we're working through getting our bombs right and in turn turning that over to the Army supply plan to get them out. The question I have is often the challenges I hear from OEMs is the reality is we no longer have the same relationships that we have in the past, we will have in the future. So how do we ensure through the acquisition process that we can give that demand signal before the PR is dropped? So I get a lot of questions about that. If I had just known this 6 months ago as we were working through the PR, we would have been able to change our rheostats at the OEM level in order to get ahead of the pulp. Can you address that?
Well, I think it goes back to everything that was on the slide, is that the OEMs a lot of times are waiting for the PR to drop. They know the demand sometimes better than we do. But if we have bad data in the system, we don't have a clear picture, and then we think it's going to take 90 days. The item manager looks and says it takes 90 days to get this PR to the OEM, and it takes 290 days. That's the challenge. So we acknowledge that's what we're working towards, because we want to be forward-looking. We want to have an accurate picture of what the requirement is, what's the lead time to get it on contract, and to react well before it becomes a crisis. Right now, we've been working in the crisis mode. Did you have?
Other questions? Okay, hey, Don, I'm not going to let you off easy. Okay, so I did some math with your slide.
Okay.
Okay, and on the low side of your eight-gate process,
Right.
okay, I add up 194 days, or basically 6.5 months from start to finish. That's the low side. On the high side, which is pretty much known in industry right now, you're at 673 days, or basically 22.5 months.
Right.
Okay? How can you speed up the cycle if we can't break through the contracting demise?
Yes, sir. So just to clarify on that chart, it depends on the type of contract, right? So not every contract has to go through every gate. Not every contract needs a first article test. So if you add up the minimum in each gate, it's relatively high, but some only have to go through 2 or 3 gates. So the important part to us is understanding what gates a contract has to go through, what is the standard in each of those gates. So now we do have a clear picture of how long it should take that type of contract to be awarded, and then holding the gatekeepers accountable to say you're a day over, you're 3 days over, and not wait until we're 60 days over before we identify it as a problem. So that's the way the gated process is supposed to work.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, if not, here you go. So how are you handling, hey, look, I told you guys,
sir,
if you don't ask questions, folks, I'm working as hard.
So I'm showing it's lunch on
No,
the
it's
schedule.
not yet. I gotta watch. Okay, so as I'm walking back there, talk to me about, or talk to us about how you're handling priority on material. In the example I will
Priority
use,
on the
priority on materials. Okay, so you've got some critical materials. Let's use one like titanium.
Right.
Okay, we want to think we're the big player in titanium. Golf clubs are the big players in titanium.
Right.
So unless you get as I understand it, a national designation on that material, whatever it is, you are not in the priority of that, and you have to get in line, which causes a lot of our long lead items. So how are we going about that?
Right. So, great question, sir. We know that on several of our readiness drivers, there are subcomponents that are holding it up that are forged items that have to go through a limited number of forging houses, and we hear that from multiple OEMs. So we are having the discussion on what the options are. I'm actually scheduling a visit to one of the forging houses, and there are DoD codes that we can claim, and we are pursuing that. We want to understand from each of the OEMs what assistance they do need from us. But you're right, a lot of times we need 300 widgets, and we're in competition with others that have massive quantities, and we are not the first priority. I also understand forging houses sometimes sell blocks at a time. So they will have blocks out in the future that are sold, and if you're not in priority years in advance, you may not have time. So we are pursuing what we can do from a DoD perspective to increase priority on those types of items because it is a challenge.
So, Mr. Nitti, some great comments this morning, and just trying to link the thread between what seems to be the core message in Mr. Marriott and your comments, which is strategic depth. Trying to understand where that supply availability or that material availability ends up lying. It's either going to end up being right with the units at a tactical level, supply support activity, with our depot storage activities at the national level, or it ends up having to rely on material availability at the OEM level, or potentially the depot level. But somebody has to have a piece of material somewhere, and I guess that's the respectful handshake that we're trying to figure out between the government and industry, is where should those materials be sitting. But somewhere there has to be material availability on a shelf or ready to produce at a moment's notice, and that's the respectful handshake. So just trying to figure out that balance between industry and government on who stores so we have strategic depth. Otherwise, it's always a production and contracting lead time away,
Right.
even if you have an IDIQ. So,
And that's the gap that we're trying to close. So ultimately, the Army should own the asset, right? We should have forecasted, purchased it, and store it ready for use. If our forecasting is accurate, the OEM knows what the next purchase is coming, when's it coming, and they're leaning forward on the procuring their material for that delivery. So ultimately, I think the material that we purchase obviously is with us, but if we're forecasting properly, OEM should be able to forecast what's coming.
Sir, good morning. The Secretary of Defense put out the letter identifying reliability and touched on major platforms, none of them Army.
I'm sorry, can you just speak up a little louder?
The Secretary of Defense put out the letter addressing reliability on major platforms. None of them addressed Army platforms. Is there any plan to go back and revise that letter to include Army platforms?
I have no idea. I wish I could answer that, but I can't. But I will write that one down and give it to Mr. Marriott.
Well, Don, we thank you very, very much. We would never be able to do what we do without you. We look forward to the readiness panel. I think you've teed it up perfectly, sir. I think it's going to be a great discussion this afternoon. I look forward to it. Remember, if you don't like my questions, think up your own, okay?